Pleasure for me to welcome everyone to this panel discussion today on a book called Nehru Tibet and China, written by Shri Avtar Singh Bhasin, who is one of the best known, one of the greatest authors and chroniclers on India's foreign policy. We have been looking forward to this discussion for some time, in fact, ever since the book came out. And I'm very happy that finally it's happening today. So, sir, a very, very warm welcome to you at Nehru Memorial once again. Of course, you have been here many times, but once again, it is our pleasure to have you here. And along with Mr. Bhasin, we have the great pleasure of having with us today our former director, Shri Shakti Sinha, who is also now Atal Bihari Vajpayee, Director, Atal Bihari Vajpayee Institute of Policy Research and International Studies, apart from, of course, doing many other important things. So, a very, very warm welcome to you, sir. And it's our pleasure to have you on this panel, sir. And I also have great pleasure in welcoming to this discussion Ambassador Vijay K. Nambiar, who was former ambassador to China and now is an honorary fellow to ICS. A very, very warm welcome to you, Ambassador Nambiar. And finally, it gives me immense pleasure to welcome Professor Srikanth Kondapalli, who is at the Center for East Asian Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University. And we have requested him not just to be present here, but also to formally chair the discussion. And so I very warmly welcome Professor Kondapalli and all other members of the audience. I'm very confident that this will be a very, very illuminating and interesting discussion because the theme, of course, is very interesting. And as I said, that Mr. Bhasin is one of the foremost writers and chroniclers on this particular subject. So with these very few words now, I would like to invite Dr. Kondapalli to chair this discussion. I think the format is that first Mr. Bhasin will make the author's remarks, and then Ambassador Nambiar will speak, and after that Shakti sir will speak.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mishra. This is indeed a privilege and an honor to chair this session with the stalwarts on the subject of India-China relations with Tibet as the focus. And in the midst of the Galwan and after, there is no other time that could have been more important than to discuss this topic today. And also with the Tirmurti as the host for the discussion, there is no other appropriate place to start with the discussion on Nehru other than the NMML. So it is indeed a privilege and an honor. I welcome all of the distinguished panelists as well as the book writer himself, who had copiously written those 5 volumes on India-China relations. This is a textbook search in various universities and other places. We thank you for the labor that you spent going through various documents, archival material. It is not easy. As researchers, we do find it is really tough. You took a lot of patience in putting it across and in a format that is easily understandable to the general public as well as the specialists. Thank you very much, Mr. Bhasin. This is indeed an occasion to celebrate the multi-voluminous work as well as the current work under discussion. So without much ado, may we request the book writer to explain the main aspects of the subject that he dealt with. Of course, this is a huge one that was being published by the Penguin, nearly 400 pages. That is, and what I liked much was we have had many writers both in the academic policy as well as in the media, who had written on the India-China border dispute, Tibet, Nehru as a personality, Nehru in his foreign policy posture towards China, or on other issues. But what I liked most was the day-to-day conversation that has happened, he accounted for, which is not seen in any other previous works. So this is one I really liked about the book. So, sir, please continue the introduction of the book. Mr. Bhasin.
Thank you, sir, for your very generous remarks, and I am obliged for that. Before I start, I would like to thank Nehru Memorial Museum and Library and its Deputy Director for giving me an opportunity to speak to you and speak to a wider audience. I'm grateful also to Professor Kondapalli, who has not spoken only generously, but has agreed to spare time to chair this meeting. I also welcome Ambassador Nambiar, who headed many of our diplomatic missions abroad, including one in China, and Mr. Shakti Sinha, who has been the director of this great institution, to which I'm obliged and indebted in many ways. To all those attending the discussion from their own places, I say a big thank you. My book, Nehru Tibet and China, is the outcome of my 5-volume study of India-China relations, published in 2018, containing more than 2,500 highly classified documents accessed from this very institution from where I am speaking today. Reading these documents struck me that decade and a half of our past post-independent history as known to us is asymmetrical to what these documents reveal to me. It gave me an idea that unless we revisit the past narrative, there is little chance of finding a solution to the imbroglio even in the present century. The border incidents that happen now and then, and sometimes threaten to create a larger conflict, would continue to happen if we continue to remain ignorant of the real facts and remain slaves to the past. In deciding to write this book, I was quite conscious that I would be challenging the established narrative handed down to us since the 50th of last century. But I sincerely believe that if I succeed in my small way in putting the bare facts before the people of India, leaving it to them to take a call on these events, I would have done my duty to the people of my country. The war in 1962 was caused for lack of understanding between India and China on the frontier question. But generally also, there were too many misperceptions that were created between the two countries in their journey to neighbors after the establishment of People's Republic of China in October 1949. For a decade and a half, India's post-independent history was dominated by Jawaharlal Nehru, who not only determined the broad contours of Indian foreign policy, but also executed them as the foreign minister. The concepts that he articulated in the pre-independence period became the template of India's foreign policy in the post-independence period. He lived with this concept as long as there was no challenge. Nehru was infatuated with Chinese ever since he came into contact with them at Brussels in 1927 while attending the Conference Against Imperialism. Thereafter, he remained convinced that the future of Asia depended on the goodwill and neighborly relation among the Asian countries, and of these, India and China must play a dominant role. He was not worried about the color of the government in China. With this event ahead, after the establishment of People's Republic of China in October 1949, and not looked back thereafter. Unfortunately, there was no synergy between Nehru's priorities and that of the new China. Nehru was committed to Asian solidarity and saw new China as a partner in its achievements. China had no use for Asian solidarity. It wanted to end the China's century of humiliation and retreat to the past glory and integrate territories which had drifted away in the last century back into China. As Mao had said on the inauguration of People's Republic of China, we shall emerge in the world as a nation with an advanced culture and one with power. The Common Minimum Program, which China had adopted at the very beginning as its constitution on 24th November 1949, demanded waging of revolutionary wars to the very end and the liberation of all territories of China which had in the past drifted away. These included Formosa, the Pescador, Hainan, and Tibet. Tibet was considered the most important one, and it pledged to liberate it by occupying it. India, on the contrary, wanted China to respect Tibet's autonomy and its separate political entity, and repeatedly advised China accordingly. The differences in their perception created misunderstanding, which were to prove critical in their relation in the years ahead. This was the time when the Indian public was generally taken in by China's friendship. Unaware that India was repeatedly being snubbed by China, first China had called Nehru the lackey of the British and the Americans. He described India's relationship with Bhutan as a part of dark vassal system and Bhutan's enslavement, and even suggested that the United Nations should examine it. Tibet proved the Achilles heel. China saw in India's advice for Tibet's autonomy its hidden agenda of preserving the facilities and privileges inherited from the British. It ignored India's concerns. It went ahead and occupied Tibet. While doing so, it bluntly warned India repeatedly that Tibet was its internal affair and no interference in its internal affairs would be tolerated. While occupying Tibet, it too wanted India against giving any asylum to Dalai Lama, which it had been promised to him. Reading China's move, Delhi found it not an easy customer to deal with, but committed to the idea that China's cooperation and also its friendship are critical, he adopted the policy of acquiescence in whatever it did, and gave the impression of friendship between them, not only to the people of India at home, but also to the world at large. It was in this spirit that China's disparaging remarks on the conduct of India's first general elections in 1952 was ignored. Nehru too had spurned repeated offers of United States for help against China should India, in the interest of its own security and Tibet's security, challenge China. He also did not pay any heed to the warning of the political officer, Reshwar Dayal, that, I quote, occupation or domination of Tibet by a potentially hostile and possibly aggressive communist power should be a threat to the security of India itself. But he did not see China a potentially hostile country. He continued to believe that India had nothing to worry from China's occupation of Tibet, and looked at its occupation benignly and said, I quote, all the border countries are affected by these developments. India is not directly affected in the sense of any military danger. Ruling out any danger from China, yet he said, and I quote, we shall not permit the slightest intervention. We shall not permit the slightest intervention, aggression, or invasion of any territory, whatever it might be. Nevertheless, when it came to standing up to China, he caved in. The humiliating remarks that China made for Nehru on the Indian resolution in the UNGA on the repatriation of Korean prisoners of war was quietly accepted. Describing the Indian resolution as Nehru's resolution, China said, and I quote, it was the parent of all evils, and even challenged Indian claim to China's friendship. To squeeze India out of Tibet, China, instead of asking for a negotiation, adopted harassing tactics, compelling India to ask for negotiation. The way China conducted the negotiations to arrive at the so-called Panchil Agreement turned out to be a dictated document, which Delhi signed on the dotted lines. After the Indian delegation was made to cool its heel for 4 long months in Beijing, India too found to its chagrin and embarrassment that in negotiating China was more sensitive to Pakistan's concern than India's. Yet Nehru described it as a very important event, glossing over the various hurdles that the Chinese had created and the surrender India had to make to clink the agreement. He was so smitten with the concept of Panchil that instantly asked his ambassador in Rangoon to commend these principles who knew Burmese Prime Minister in its relation with China. As Tibet revolted, China saw in India a villain in everything that went wrong for it there. To sum up, there was no sign of friendship from the Chinese side. Nehru, to protect the Bhai-Bhai relationship, kept everything under wrap, making the people live under the ruinous impression of great friendship. On the question of frontier, the story is no better. If I'm asked to sum up the India-China border problem in one sentence, I will choose a sentence from the speech of Foreign Secretary Shri, which he delivered at the annual conference of the governors of Indian states on 28 October 1959. And he said, I quote, the Srikanth-Tibet boundary, delimited 1896, was the only boundary along the entire frontier which was properly delimited. This was a clear admission in that out of the about 3,500 kilometer length of India-China border, only 220 kilometer length was actually delimited and the rest of the boundary needed delimitation. Obviously, India should have been anxious to undertake that exercise with the other shareholder, China. On the contrary, he remained not only reluctant but in denial that there was any need for it. And that is what proved to be the villain of the peace. Talking of frontiers, let me emphasize that international borders are agreed borders between stakeholders. The lines on the maps separate the geographical and political jurisdiction of the countries on their side of the lines. They reflect the vagaries and irrationalities of history. Well-defined, mutually agreed borders come into being as a result of adjustment of rival claims, interests, and ambitions of the stakeholders. Unilateralism in marking or altering an international border will show recipe for conflict and even disaster. Both the eastern and western borders had its infirmities of one kind or the other. Nehru ignored them, declared in Parliament in November 1951 that McMahon Line was India's border in the east, map or no map, and India would not let anybody cross it. About the western border, he said, it was marked by uses and custom, but made no claim like he made in the case of McMahon Line. A look at the history of McMahon Line would show it was that China had never accepted it since it had not even signed the Shimla Convention and had declared it illegal. Nehru was well aware of it, and he himself said that no previous Chinese government had accepted it, and New China was unlikely to accept it either. Yet he insisted that China must accept it. It is the fact of history that Taiwan, which India later called Northeast Frontier Agency, remained in Tibet's occupation until 1951, when India occupied it. It is relevant to point out that in 1940, the political officers of Bhasin Gold had conveyed to Tibet that the British would amend the McMahon Line to run south of it. However, the formalities for the amendment were not done by the time British left India in 1947. Thereafter, when India became independent, Tibet was still in Tibet's occupation. India too had in 1948 conveyed to Tibet that it would amend the border in Tibet's favor in Tawang area. It was only when China occupied Tibet in 1950 that India became jittery that even a Chinese occupation of Tibet, China's border would come down to the plains of Assam, creating a secure dilemma. In April 1951, India sent a military detachment and occupied it, brushing aside Tibetan protests. Even the McMullen line was not scientifically drawn, and we have it on the testimony of Henry McMahon himself. For that, in 1935, in a lecture in London, under the auspices of the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Art, he had said that, I quote, "For want of accurate local knowledge and absence of detailed surveys rendered it impossible to define the larger portion of it except in somewhat general way. As such, it was now necessary that the border was scientifically drawn after conducting surveys. The western border in Ladakh, which ran along the Aksai chain, was undefined in the Survey of India maps that India inherited in 1947, and it continued to remain undefined in the subsequent years when the Survey of India reprinted them. When the talks on Tibet agreement were to take place in 1954, India had instructed its delegation that in negotiating on Tibet, not to discuss the frontier question. The frontiers were accordingly not discussed. Nehru, however, presumed that by not discussing the borders, they stood settled and used this argument several times, but China did not naturally buy it since it was untenable. After the Tibet agreement was signed on 29 April 1954, a couple of months later, in July, Nehru instructed the MEA, Ministry of External Affairs, that the old maps showing the border alignment with Aksai chain as undefined were withdrawn and new maps were issued with a definite line which should be India's border in future and not open for discussion with anyone. This was the international border, and it was important that the other stakeholder, China, was consulted before the line was drawn. Not doing so created a problem, particularly when Nehru would not respond to Chinese pleas made repeatedly that as a modern state, there was a need for scientifically drawn borders which would be accepted to both the stakeholders.
Is this a book reading session? I think it's a book reading session going on here. Is it a discussion at all?
Oh, he's discussing it. Don't worry.
If one were to look at the discussion in Parliament in 1959, Nehru repeatedly indicated that in the western sector there was no demarcation. And it is rather difficult to say where the immediate border line, although broadly it may be known, but it's very difficult in the map to locate it. Again, in the September 1959, speaking on an adjournment motion in Parliament, Nehru, while playing down the Chinese incursion, called them very petty and ascribed them to there being no demarcation at all and parties may sometime cross. Nehru, however, remained wedded to the argument that even if the borders were not demarcated, they were well known by usage and custom and by the application of the watershed principle. No doubt, these are important inputs in negotiating a border, but they are by themselves not enough to define a border. In yet another time, he admitted that it was a fact that parts of Ladakh is broadly covered by the white sheep of their map, Chinese map. In spite of this, he repeatedly accepting that the border suffered from various deficiencies and infirmities for lack of demarcation. He continued to insist that there was no need for any demarcation. It was a dichotomous position that he continued to maintain, which was inimical to peaceful solution of the intractable problem. Nehru, while continuing to suffer from uncertainty, would not come to the table to clear his doubts. The result was, as we know, 1962. I thank everybody for his patience to listen to me. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bhasin, for laying down the contours of the book on China, India, Nehru, the Tibet-related issue, and
Mr. Kondapalli, can you speak a bit louder? We can't hear you clearly.
yes, I was saying that the speaker had laid down the contours of the book in terms of China, India, and Tibet-related issues. The negotiations that have happened between the missions, between Chongqing, Nanjing, Beijing at one point or the other, Lhasa, Gangtok, and other places, including the internal communications between the Prime Minister and the Ministry of External Affairs and other stakeholders, including the Tibetans. The discussions between them has been laid down, and a very robust and very interesting discussion that has happened during the 50s and early 60s. The book ends, of course, at the 1962 conflict and the aftermath. And so the broad discussion today would be confined to that period. Although, of course, as part of reflection, one can also mention a few. And now with this, let me invite Ambassador Nambiar, Vijay Nambiar. He is a participant policymaker within these confines of India, China, Tibet relations. And so we are privileged, sir, to have you to discuss this issue.
Thank you, Srikanth, for inviting me. And I'd like, first of all, to congratulate Bhasin Saab for his significant contribution to the furtherance of the public understanding of India-China relations during the critical years of independent India, and for exploring many of the underlying historical factors that crucially affected the determination and implementation of India's policies. This he has also explained just now, and many of the things which have previously, in a sense, either been glossed over or not even been informed publicly to the Indian public, which were in fact in the files in various in the papers, both in the Nehru Memorial as well as in the Ministry of External Affairs. Now, this book also obviously follows his magisterial 5-volume collation, and that itself is an acknowledged masterpiece. And this, while being equally rich in detail, is more forthright, direct, and unsparing, as I mentioned earlier. Now, the title of the book says it all. It's about Nehru, Tibet, and China. Now, I'll speak from a slightly different angle and not go into many of the details which Bhasin Saab has already gone. I will try to speak briefly on what is called the so-called allure of China for Pandit Nehru. That is, I think, and that has had a major effect on the foreign policy of that period, particularly the 50s, and even starting from, as Bhasin Saab said, from 1927. Next, I should try to raise some points about the Chinese allegation that Nehru was a lackey of British imperialists and preserved their colonial outlook, and compare it with China's own outlook on Tibet. I shall reflect on the Tibet conundrum for China and why Nehru was unwilling or unable to finalize negotiations on the border agreement between India and China. Obviously, these are within the time, it will be very, very, very broad. Prime Minister Nehru's own vision of resurgent Asia was strongly influenced by what he described as the allure of China. How strong this vision was influenced by earlier leaders like Rabindranath Tagore is difficult to say. But in 1924 itself, when Tagore visited China, he advocated a regional vision for Asia that moved beyond the narrow confines beyond the narrow nationalism and towards what he called a civilizational dialogue based on rationalism and universality. Tagore, of course, felt his great kinship with China, and he called it Shraddha. Mahatma Gandhi spoke of the real friendship between India and China not being based on economics and politics, but what he called irresistible attraction. There was something somewhat emotional in the descriptions that these leaders made. Nehru's first noteworthy encounter with the Chinese took place at the World Congress of Oppressed Nationalities in 1927. The Chinese representative then was Sun Ching-ling, who was Sun Yat-sen's wife, and mostly left-wing members of the Kuomintang party. Impressed by these representatives who were greatly influenced by the Pan-Asianist dialogue, Nehru started forming his views about the civilizational affinity between India and China. In fact, in his letter to his daughter in 1930, he spoke of some unseen force, as it were. He called it unseen force, shaping the future destiny of the world and drawing India and China towards each other. In his glimpses of world history, he describes China as the other great country, India's old-time friend. And he talks about China being more influenced by India than India by China. And he talked about we need to learn from their sound common sense and help check our own extravagant fancies, he said. In 1938, obviously, the Congress Party, largely at the instance of Nehru, decided to dispatch a medical mission to China, which, apart from having, of course, Dr. Kotnis, was led by Dr. Madan Mohanlal Atal, who was a Kashmiri and a relative of Kamala Nehru herself. In a radio broadcast prior to visiting China in August 1939, Nehru declared glowingly that he was an agent of historic destiny, and that he was talking of the pilgrims of the past who pledged the comradeship in the great tasks of today and tomorrow, etc. He had actually planned to visit Yan'an to meet Mao Zedong, but that did not happen because of the sudden outbreak of World War II. It is this knowledge and allure of China that decisively shaped and determined Nehru's vision of India-China relations in the immediate post-colonial world. A major inflection point, as Bhasin Saab said, was the Asian Relations Conference in April 1947. And that Nehru wished to showcase as the heralding of the dawn of the post-colonial world. But here, instead of showing an identity of the perceptions between the two countries, it was the differences between them that was on show. And that related mainly to the status of Tibet. Actually, the Chinese strongly protested the invitation to Tibet as an independent country, and then Nehru had, through KPS Menon, to assure the Chinese side that the conference will deal primarily with cultural and economic matters, and that the issue of Tibet's status will not be raised. It was only then that Chiang Kai-shek agreed to send a delegation. But these assurances themselves by India proved untrustworthy to the Chinese delegation because they found a map depicting Tibet as a separate country. Now, the Chinese threatened to withdraw, not only that, but they refused to let India become the permanent host for future Pan-Asian conferences. And this public bickering was a severe blow to Nehru's efforts to display India-China solidarity. But the same fascination that Nehru displayed for China was clearly not reciprocated by the Chinese side. In fact, even there have been reports, even during Tagore's time in 1924, the opinion in China was not the same as Tagore had probably felt. Of course, there were some leaders who did feel the kinship with India, as it were. Even before the promulgation of the PRC in June 1949, Nehru described the communist revolution as one of the biggest changes and upheavals in history, with far-reaching consequences. And he rationalized also that the Chinese understanding of Marxism would be separate from that of the Soviet Union. But what Nehru failed to appreciate fully was the place that Tibet occupied in the psyche of Han Chinese leaders. I say Han Chinese leaders over recent history. Let me get to some history at this stage. The history of Qing imperialist engagement in Inner Asia and Tibet was every bit as colonial as that of the Western powers in Asia and Africa. This is a judgment that many China scholars make very strongly today. The Manchu emperor's territorial expansion into Inner Asia was without precedent in Chinese history. And there is a scholar who says that the Qing pacification of the independent territories in the northwest and south of China was in magnitude one of the largest territorial expansions in 17th and 18th century world history. If the distinguishing feature of modern colonialism was not colonies per se, but the political domination of the imperial periphery, on the basis of cultural superiority, then Qing rule in Tibet, Mongolia, and Xinjiang did not differ, according to many of these scholars, from the European penetration of overseas dependencies. The Qing too developed original systems of administration, and above all, it was the sophistication of the Qing administration of Inner Asia that brought it closer to its European counterparts. In fact, it's interesting that one scholar has recently even said that the precedent for the unequal treaties was actually established by the Qings themselves in the pattern of their treaties with the Central Asian countries themselves. The first unequal treaty was negotiated by Qing China with the Khan of Kokand in 1835. It included conditions of extraterritoriality, merchant autonomy, permanent resident political representation. Now, this was what was later used by the British to extract from China after the Opium Wars. Admittedly, the relationship with Tibet was completely different. This was, of course, traditional, what they call peace patron relations. And for the Tibetans themselves, the ties with China was viewed in the perspective of two laws, that is the state law of China and the religious law of Tibet. And the three countries, China, Tibet, and Mongolia, were seen as a formula that placed Tibet within China without causing it to disappear. And so this idea of one law and one state, this actually was only brought by Qianlong himself. And it is interesting that there was a major difference in the perspective of the Manchus and the Hans. It was only after the Han officials joined as Ambans in late 19th century under the Qing rule that the Manchu perspective of treating them as frontier areas was changed, and it was progressively included as inseparable components of China. This was a time when China was losing its control over other areas in Korea and other places. And this complexity was compounded by the evolution of the British legal description of suzerainty, which was primarily sought by Britain in order to avoid accretion of Tsarist Russian influence over Tibet. Now, after the revolution in China, once the power was transferred to the Chinese nation state, they talked about 5 peoples, the territory of the 5 ethnic groups, Manchu, Mongol, Han, Muslim, and Tibetan, to form one great republic. Sun Yat-sen talked about it. Now, this is the kind of approach which the Chinese had, the Han Chinese had, towards Tibet progressively, and that was both Republican as well as, in fact, even before, in the Qing, the last few years, decades, the Qing also talked about the Wuzhu, or the 5 ethnic groups. It is in this context that the historian Madhavan Palat makes an interesting point that in the morrow of India's independence, Prime Minister Nehru was realistic in his understanding of boundaries and frontiers. He was conscious that the concept of mobile frontiers was part of an expansionist colonial mindset and would be unsuitable for an independent India. Nehru understood that boundaries were part of a globalism that was an aspect of subordination to an international order, not the expansion of a single state and the permanent struggle that they have to do to expand their continuous borders. But it is clear from history that this was not the lesson, for example, Mao and other leaders learned from their colonial experience. Mao and the Chinese present leaders not only embraced the Qing expansionist colonial mindset, but also in the process ignored the sophistication and nuance that the Qings had brought to the governance of these colonies. They just absorbed these territories, further consolidated them through demographic transfers of Han population to these peripheral areas that had been initiated even under Manchus. But in the 50s, as India and China emerged as independent countries in the midst of the polarizations of the Cold War, it was the effects of this polarization, this Cold War polarization on China that worried Nehru the most. He was deeply convinced that the political isolation of communist China by the US was increasing tensions around the world, and the only way to diffuse them was to bring China into the diplomatic mainstream. The resultant efforts by China and by Nehru and Panikkar to reach out to China during the 50s, and the role played by India in the Korean War, the birth of Panchsheel and Bandung, it was part of this mindset that was directed not so much by dogma as an anxiety to avert the aggravation of Cold War tensions. And it is this particular mental approach, as it were, that caused Nehru, though he had been continuously, in fact, informed, briefed by the ICS leaders, Girja Shankar Bajpai, Subi Masdad, KPS Menon, but his view was actually away from, because they had wanted a preservation, a continuation, as it were, of the British mindset, the British attitude. We are actually moving away from Britain. We are taking independence from Britain, and we can't be guided by this mindset alone. Bilaterally, of course, while there was concern in India over the need, and Nehru was certainly not necessarily just an idealist, there was concern to maintain the buffer of Tibet, but even Sardar Patel recognized this would not be possible after the advent of the People's Republic of China without risking overt conflict. The only realistic option, and which Nehru actually tried to push, was to take at face value Beijing's assurances to respect Tibet's autonomy and respect its religious freedom under the Dalai Lama. This was sought to be achieved in the 1954 agreement on Tibet. And he went to the extent eventually of accepting all the sort of the closing down of the various consulates, etc., including the consulate on horseback, as it was mentioned in those days. But whereas India saw this agreement in 1954, which talked about Panchsheel, India saw this as a promise of autonomy for Tibet and continuance of India's traditional ties with Tibet. What the Chinese saw in the agreement was a recognition by India of Chinese sovereignty over Tibet and a pledge of non-interference. It took only a few years for Beijing's real intentions to surface, causing the flight in 1959 of the Dalai Lama and his seeking asylum in India. Nehru was all too conscious of the urgency, given India's actual resource constraints, of prioritizing its economic development over building the country's military sinews. His failing was perhaps that in the course of excessively projecting India's diplomacy, both regionally and multilaterally, he and his advisors did not see the criticality of ensuring that such a projection was kept carefully within the ambit of our comprehensive national strength. It was also notable that around the time of the Tibet Agreement of 54, Nehru deliberately set aside the advice of all his bureaucratic colleagues to take up bilaterally with China the serious differences between the two countries on where the boundary lay. On the contrary, he decided unilaterally, as Bhasin Saab had explained to us, to declare the delineation of this boundary, and in the process, he blocked off all possibility of any substantive give and take on such a boundary. The period between 56 and 59, perhaps, was the most critical period where a settlement was perhaps possible. But that presupposed some acceptance by India of the need for compromise. In fact, this was what Nehru had suggested to UNU, actually, for their discussions. The Chinese were never prepared for detailed discussions on the boundary based on historical analysis, documents, or argument. They were looking for a broad political deal and an understanding. Zhou Enlai had more or less indicated this during his visit in 1956. He was keen on safeguarding the security of the road between Xinjiang and Tibet, and a road which, of course, the military attaché had talked about it in his own message, as Bhasin Saab has mentioned, and even Nehru was aware of it. But on the ground, I don't think the people who were patrolling these areas had even intended to go that far to even know about what was happening. Now, another important issue for Zhou Enlai was Tibet was His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who was there in 56, who was in India during his visit in 56, and of course who came later in in 1959. But even in 1958, in his December letter to Zhou Enlai, Nehru did not mention the road. He did not mention anything about the Western sector. It was only after the Konka incident in 59 that he turned his attention to the Western sector. Actually, Bhasin Saab in his book has made a searing reference to what he calls Nehru's hallucinations. It comes on page 64. I think it's important to read it, and I shall just make a small quotation of that and perhaps mention some other connection. Nehru's hallucinations about India-China-Tibet relations were unfathomable, he says. On the one hand, he was impressed by China's greatness, and on the other, he was worried about its long-term intentions, both towards India and Tibet. He was reconciled to China's takeover of Tibet, but wanted it to be done peacefully by negotiating with Lhasa. He knew China had never recognized the Simla Convention, yet he insisted that China recognized Tibetan autonomy flowing from it. He knew China had never he knew China had never recognized the McMahon Line, yet he insisted that that was India's border and non-negotiable. Dichotomously, Nehru saw in the Chinese Revolution the rise of Asia from the ashes of colonialism. He had welcomed the new Chinese leadership as a messiah who would make China a great country once again and help foster his dream of Asian solidarity. There's, on page 222 again, he makes some very interesting, Bhasin Saab makes some very interesting collation of Nehru's, his contrarieties, as it were. Nehru had doubts about the boundary between the two countries, yet he himself remained immune to the advice he gave liberally to UNU, that is, to negotiate a border agreement with China, it was necessary to have give and take and not follow a rigid line. China's not signing Simla Convention, he said, offered enough hints that it would not accept the McMahon Line. Nehru did repeatedly feel the need to take up the issue of borders with China, but made no particular attempt and instead declared them non-negotiable. So this kind of running between various, contrary impulses happened continuously, particularly during the late 50s, when public opinion was increasingly being geared after the incidents in Longju and Konka. As the India-China relationship began to sour during the late 50s and early 60s, and differences on the boundary began to grow, the government was under constant and continuing domestic pressure to issue white papers in its dealings with China on this issue and to declare a forward policy, as well as to respond to Chinese provocations with tit-for-tat action in the misplaced belief that this would not result in an all-out war with the country. This obviously was a major miscalculation. Even after the 1962 war, Nehru tried to describe that conflict as what he called, quote, a minor blip in the larger panorama of our relations, unquote. But that was not the way the country viewed it. The nation has viewed the war as a betrayal and humiliation wrought on India and its own leaders and by a ruthless and calculating neighbor. Mao's gesture in 1970 to Mrs. Gandhi through Ambassador Mishra, when he referred to the two countries as ancient civilizations and that we could not go on quarreling like this, was ultimately only a tactical move in the context of the move China was beginning to make towards the US. His exchanges with Kissinger revealed deep disdain and indeed contempt for India, which was eagerly pandered to and incited by Kissinger. It is notable that another recent book on India-China relations by Kanti Bajpai also refers to disrespect and disdain as the dominant Chinese sentiment towards India and Indians, and the stereotypes that developed between the two countries as having deep-seated racial undertones. This is something which really, I think, needs to be examined seriously. And I think we need to, both sides have to see that this is contained. Perhaps it was only Prime Minister Zhou Enlai who had any real opportunity during his 3 visits to India to have a true glimpse of Nehru's personality and worldview. But like most other leaders, he too gave little praise in public to the role played by India, for example, for the solution of the Korean problem, whereas India got more than its fair share of, in the Chinese press, of criticism that it did not adopt the China's line. As reported by Raghavan, China's top, that is Ambassador Raghavan, China's top leaders considered India not as a friend, but as useful, as it was more or less certain to remain neutral in any conflict. It is pertinent to add that notwithstanding the considerable reputation Zhou had managed to garner over the years, especially in the West, as, quote, perhaps the most notable diplomatic conjurer since Bismarck, he was not about using devious and undignified methods to achieve China's diplomatic purpose. There is a very interesting reference. It's not in this book, but I think Raghavan speaks of an instance in 1954 on the eve of the signing of the prisoners of war agreement between China and the United States, when Brigadier B.M. Kaul was on a private visit to Beijing. Zhou Enlai sought him out to complain about his superior officer, General K.S. Thimayya, who was then the head of the NNRC, the Neutral Nations Repatriation Commission. That this sniping was done in the presence of an MEA officer and even tolerated by the Indian side is difficult to comprehend. As Ambassador Raghavan said, it would never have, this deliberate undermining of Thimayya before a junior officer was reflective of Zhou's disregard for scruple and diplomatic practice. Scholars often rationalize such Chinese behavior in terms of their traditional stratagem devised since the period of the warring states of deception and deceit, but this does not make it any less reprehensible. On the other hand, one can hardly condone or brush aside the humiliating and unpleasant experiences Zhou was subjected to during his last visit in 1960, especially in his meetings with senior Indian cabinet ministers, that left him bitter and frustrated. Even the Supreme Court of India had by then ruled in March 1960 that no territory could be ceded without an amendment of the Constitution that needed parliamentary support that was inconceivable in a time when the public opinion was so aroused. After the war, Zhou even tried to reach out to Nehru through the Indian CDA with a practical proposal for meeting outside either country, but that proposal was dismissed summarily by a now totally disillusioned Indian Prime Minister. That was one of the last major actions which Prime Minister Nehru took. Notably, Zhou was one of the few leaders who visited the Indian mission on the death of Pandit Nehru to mourn his death, which reflects the extent of his personal esteem for Nehru. Notwithstanding all this, I think it is necessary to underline that Zhou was not the final arbiter of Chinese policy. He was always forced to completely subordinate his views to those of Mao. Both Chinese and foreign commentators have reflected abundantly on Zhou's abjectly servile behavior in the presence of Chairman Mao. Now, let me point one small factual error in the book. I regret that I was not able to point this out to Bhasin Saab earlier. He states that India was the first non-communist state to recognize the PRC. This is factually incorrect. Burma was the first non-communist state to recognize, but it was actually a result of an understanding between India and Burma, basically at that time. Here too, however, there is a history. India was still in the process of announcing its recognition. It is UNU who personally interceded with Panditji to allow Burma to do so. To my mind, it is significant that after 1962, and especially in the post-Mao era, it was only Deng Xiaoping among Chinese leaders who had a broad-minded and comprehensive perspective of India-China relations against the backdrop of an Asian resurgence. He revealed this in his conversations with Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi in 1988. But with Xi Jinping now, and with the dramatic growth of China, as well as the vast power gap between the two countries, even that perspective has been drastically transformed. The new Chinese dream envisions a China that is much more hierarchical and hegemonistic vis-a-vis its neighbors, including India. I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Namiyar, for that deconstructing Nehru, as well as some of the controversial issues that we faced during 1950s.
Yeah.
The Hindi Chini Bye Bye phase, the decision-making process within China, and of course the mobile frontiers, as you mentioned, which Nehru was fearful about, and also, of course, the unequal treaties. We were bred on so much of political propaganda on the unequal treaties, although Mao himself mentioned about being flexible on that issue as well when discussing about the territorial disputes with the 14 land neighbors that China had. In the policy speech that he made in 1949, he does mention about this, which Chou Enlai reiterates on being flexible on the unequal treaties. But also, strangely, if I may mention, the Sino-French Convention on Indochina and Vietnam was also actually a reverse of unequal treaty, which they imposed on Vietnam, another communist country. So there is that factor as well. I think that this deconstruction is very useful. Let me add here that the discovery of India, which was translated into Chinese in 1956, it was wrongly translated. Some of the phrases that Nehru used, for instance, he said, India will not play a second fiddle to any country. In one of the passages here, he was visualizing when he was writing how India would unfold after independence. The Chinese translated this as saying that India will be number one in the world, and so it is a threat to China. In 1956 translation of this has influenced a whole generation of Chinese scholars, Chinese politicians. They have, of course, a fantastic team of translators, but this particular phase also has a problematic in terms of translation. Recently, they began retranslating Discovery of India. Let us see if they do any justice to the 1950s and 60s. Let me turn to Sinha Saab. He's also a participant, policy maker, and had a substantial contribution on the period of 1950s and Nehru, Tibet, and other aspects. So.
Exposition by Ambassador. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay. After completely magisterial exposition by Ambassador Vijay Nambiar, there's not too much I can say, but because some of it was, I've already written it down, so I'll delete that. First of all, let me thank Nehru Memorial for organizing this. Feels happy. This book deserves a lot more publicity. A lot more people should be reading this book, because we have all been fed on this Aksai Chin business that you have so rightly exposed, as being, I can even say dubious. But where I would slightly take off from here, 1954 delimitation, is that there I agree with the Chinese. Let us junk the colonial maps. In our negotiation with the Chinese in 61, we did mention the Treaty of Chushul. We have also mentioned the Treaty of Tinmasgang of 1584, which was a very important treaty, which in fact things also give the king of Ladakh control over the district of Menser, whose revenues would be used for lighting the lamp at Kailash and the holy lakes of Mansarovar and Rakastal. And that somehow just disappeared from Indian memory, even in the 54 agreement, completely disappeared from Indian memory. Though Kushak Bakula in 53 had gone to Menser and collected taxes there. So this was there, very much there. Book is a sad story, no doubt, because if you see the opportunities lost, the fact that India-China relations, Chinese expansionism apart, could have taken on a different turn altogether. I mean, they were making it clear again and again to us, we don't recognize the McMahon line. However, we recognize reality. Some places you have exceeded it, we'll accept that also. So So I think there was a massive opportunity lost. But again, going back to the Western sector, the Dogra Raj, the trade routes between Leh and Lhasa, and specifically Leh and Lhasa was a straight route via Gatok, but the route to Yarkand, which was very important because Leh did a lot of trading with Yarkand, Turkestan those days. There were 3 routes. And if you look at those routes, one of course was the winter route as it was called, where the Shiok River, where you crossed in and out to Karakoram and then through. But the summer routes were very, very important. The summer routes from Leh to Yarkand, Khardungla, Nubra, Sashela, Karakoram, then on to Suget Pass, and the other one, the one which went to Changla, Changchenmo, Lingtiang, and via Shahidullah. And the Dogras actually maintained for some time a military post at Shahidullah. So it is not just the 54 delimitation was unilateral, no doubt about it, but we should have gone into our own history a little bit more. If Chinese probably had a weaker claim to accession. But the reality was Chinese went there, they built the road there, and we did not know. If we are claiming it as our territory, we should have known. We did not know this. So they said opportunity lost, but also inadequate history work done. So, Bhasin
Sir, if I may just interrupt, there is some disturbance in your line, perhaps. We are losing it off and on, sir.
Okay, so I shall remove my earphones are misbehaving, I think. So let me block my earphones. Now can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you better now.
Thank you. So we could have gone into the bit of a Dogra history and the Ladakh history to see that there were substantial historical elements in our favor, which we could have used. Where I'm a little uncomfortable with, which has come through in the book very clearly, that such initiatives at the top it is taken can only be political, can never be detailed. The detailed parts must be done prior to that at the official level. Unfortunately, India did not have a full-time external affairs minister because Nehru was the external affairs minister. Nehru would never allow anybody else to be external affairs minister. And even the deputy minister's job was to answer parliament questions basically. If there could be some amount of leadership at that level, things possibly would have different. But what emerged was actually groupthink throughout. Even people who knew differently changed tack when they saw that this was the position Nehru was taking. I quote Ambassador Parthasarathy saying that though he believed that there should be negotiations, when he saw what was happening, he even ruled out mutual concession. He says mutual concession is not the way to go forward. How else do you negotiate without mutual concession? It can't be unilateral, it has to be mutual. That is a sad reflection how so many professionals, Bhasin Saab has pointed out how the then foreign secretary even wrote things which didn't exist. The Chinese have agreed, which did not have agreed. That is very, very unfortunate. But I would go back to, again, the second point basically is the point which Nambiar said. Why did Nehru take the stand that he took in 1954 or drawing a line on the border? And I would put it to Tibet. Basically, I'm of the belief, many people will probably share it, that in many matters Nehru was a realist. Nehru realized the potential of China. Nehru realized the potential of China. Nehru saw the revolutionary zeal of China. This made Nehru extremely uncomfortable. But he wanted to balance it out by hoping that ultimately...
Sir, if I may just interrupt you, sorry, sir. Neither your video nor the voice is good enough, sir, right now.
What do I do, Mishraji?
Sir, if you switch off the video, probably the voice will be better, sir.
Okay, I shall switch off my video. You don't have to see my face. Is it any better now?
Yes, it is, sir. It's quite clear. It's clearly audible now.
Hopefully, it will continue to be audible. So Nehru was supremely realistic in many matters. He saw China. He was worried about it. He was worried about its rise. He saw what China was doing, occupying Tibet. And the developments of Tibet affected him very, very deeply. If you look at the whole history, I won't repeat it, the 51 agreement. So we kept saying that, yes, we have no problem with China, PRC. And let me use the word PRC, not China. It was PRC and PLA which occupied Tibet. Okay, Tibet is part of China, but Tibet's autonomy should be retained. But we never conveyed that to the Chinese ever because we realized the Chinese would not accept our intervention in Tibet. So that, and China's encroachment of Tibet's autonomy even though China sometimes told us, Tibet fellows do on their own, the Tibetan army is doing it, not the PLA. So, it was a complicated situation, but it was distinctly uncomfortable to us. So 51 and 54, I think, reveals that fact that we realized that we were in a weak position, and therefore we should not do anything to aggravate the Chinese. But to balance that, we drew the line in Aksai Chin, and that obviously got complicated. But Bhasin Saab, one thing, yes, Nehru wanted to visit Tibet. He actually crossed Tibet on way to Bhutan in 58, if I remember correctly. By horseback, he did go into Tibet, without a visa, I think. But that didn't matter, actually. But Nehru's belief in geography, Nehru's belief in non-alignment, and in his own standing in the world, he thought that would be enough. Realizing that India did not have the economic resources to build up a strong defense, the two options were getting into a military alliance, which he rejected. Other was using India's position in the world and non-alignment and Nehru's own standing in the world to get India through this rough waters. That, I think, was where we went wrong. In fact, I'll just divert here. Mr. Vajpayee's first important speech in Parliament was in December 57, when he praised Nehru in the beginning. He says, you have a very high stature in the world. And says, each time a prime minister's stature in the world goes up, India loses out. India's interests get affected again and again. In a way, reflecting what Nehru himself told the interim parliament in 49, that India's interests will not guide our foreign policy. Strengthening peace in the world is what we want. So, so I guess that Supreme Realist also had this very healthy dose of ego, which Zhou Enlai objected to many times later on talking to people at Bandung, at other places. He felt that Nehru was being extremely arrogant towards him. Do you understand? Let me take you around. Let me introduce you, so and so. Chinese took quite a fair amount of dislike to it. But yes, China 49 onwards realized that it must be the number one power in Asia. And the two countries which have to be destabilized to do so would be India and Japan. Hence, the continued engagement with Korea on the one hand, and cultivation of Pakistan at a period when Pakistan was a US ally, when Pakistan was sending out planes, CIS U-2 planes were going over it, yet they realized that no, China, Pakistan have a natural affinity for each other because of the need to keep India out. I think that showed that we were unable to actually understand that, and the fact that Ayub Khan had offered a joint defense agreement against China, which we rejected very strongly because we don't enter into alliances and why should the Chinese fight us, etc. I think these were signs that we were misreading the situation. We were not able to think through. We have the benefit of hindsight to say so it's easy to blame, but practitioners also should be a little more careful at the time of doing so. I will not speak longer. I'll just end with a small, Bhasin Saab, you should use one form of spelling. You are using both forms of spelling, the pinyin and the earlier way you guys said. So Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai come across as Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, but Chute and all the others come out in the old style of writing. The cities, Qinghai, all of them are written, in the old version, not in the pinyin version. I think the editors should be told to adopt. I'm not blaming you for it. The editors should adopt a uniform method of spelling, and coming and not kemong. So there are some editorial mistakes which you should take up with the editors. We hope that this book gets into a second and a publication because it really deserves to be well read. It's very difficult to nations to accept, to change stands. Very difficult to accept that we have made mistakes or we were unilateral. But I think at some stage, the truth must, in that sense, be accepted by us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sinha sir. I think that is very necessary intervention for the earlier period of 1950s. One of the, if I can say this, one of the major things that we can take it from here is we need to look at our own historical records on the Western sector, Eastern sector, as you have mentioned about the Ladakh to Yarkand route documents or the other in other areas of the border. I think there is a necessity for us to look at these more carefully rather than through the British eyes or other evidences. With this, may I request Mr. Bhasin to respond to some of the comments that were made at this moment, and then we collect some points from the audience if they have any interventions to make. Bhasin sir.
Yes, yes, sir. Well, I don't have much to say because Mr. Nambiar has drawn a very broad picture. But I was given the 15 minutes to confine myself to the analysis of what I have done within the parameters of my book. And as an author, I had to defend my book, and therefore I confine myself to the limited subject of this period. As far as this cultural impact is concerned, I've dealt in the introduction how Nehru was influenced from 1927 until independence on about China. What he had been discussing, what he had been saying in various ways, all discussed in my introduction. Regarding what Mr. Shakti Sinha said, that Nehru visited Tibet. Yes, he did not visit Tibet. He passed through Tibet. Sorry.
I said so. I said that. I said that
He was invited to come to Tibet, but Chinese went on postponing. He had blocked certain time for going to Tibet, but Chinese went on postponing because the conditions within Tibet were not congenial for his visit. So, but they only said, wait. Finally, Nehru decided not to go and decided to go to Bhutan. Now, at that time, the way to Bhutan was via Tibet. Yatung. So he had to go there. He did not visit.
No,
Tibet.
since I'm sorry to interrupt you, I agree with you. You could also go to Bhutan by the Pucholing route, which is in use today also. So don't climb up the hills. Just take the Tarai route, and it is possible. But you're right. He didn't visit Tibet, but he crossed Tibet consciously, very consciously.
So, but for that, I think another thing Mr. Nambiar said about my factual mistake of first recognition or second recognition. Well, if there was some arrangement between Nehru, who knew that he should hold his announcement and I should make my announcement first, that I didn't know, I must confess, and neither any of my records suggest that, and neither any book has recorded it. It was maybe Mr. Nambiar had much greater access to paper, being for doctor and being senior officer in the ministry, and he had better access to, and he could say that, and I accept it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can we open this for discussion? Do the audience have any points to raise on this important question? Issue? If everyone is gathering thoughts, let me intervene here.
Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Oh, I had a question here. It was very interesting because Ambassador Nambiar mentioned that Kanti Bajpayee's recent book had said that China looked towards India with disrespect and not in a different attitude. So I was thinking maybe perhaps India's Panchsheel spirit had prompted India to propose China as a permanent member of the Security Council. Do you think that could have had an effect, that China had a different view towards India? Little bit of disdain towards India because we proposed China to be the permanent Security Council member.
The question is for whom?
Should I respond?
Do you want me to respond to that?
Anyone? Maybe Professor Nambiar could mention, or Professor Pali.
Let me make some points, if I may, Srikanth, with your permission. Look, I want to say that the relationship at the civilizational level, I think, that if there is any country that China feels indebted to, it is only one country, and that is India. I mean, I think there is, so civilizationally, there is a sense of indebtedness which China can talk about Buddhism and all that, but that did not stand very well with them. And you could see, particularly in the discussions on, for example, Tagore's visit, there was a great deal of a sense of, why is this representative of India grandstanding as if he represents Asia, etc. There was a sense of, our being a little too big for our, and China, big civilizational entity in itself. There was never a sense of viewing India, and of course, Girija Shankar Bajpayee attributes it to jealousy. I don't know if that is necessarily true, but I must mention that even Kanti Bajpayee, when he talks about disrespect and disdain, and he talks about deep-seated racial undertones, he talks of it in both countries. It's not talking of one country alone. I mean, it's amply, in a sense, in some ways, there is also a certain sense of, I think big civilizations have this tendency to become somewhat capable of other influences which are not, in a sense, or else to seek the origin of that, the genesis of ideas, etc., in India. Or, we tend to also do the same thing, and the Chinese tend to do the same thing too. So I don't think that this is something which is, it's a general kind of opinion, it's a general kind of attitudinal approach among the masses and among some scholars, among the intellectuals also. Husserl, for example, does talk about very, very strongly the impact of India on China, but he says it with a certain amount of embarrassment almost. So there is that kind of sense. I don't think it has anything to do with the Security Council and things like that. Thank you.
Okay.
Is there anyone from the audience who want to intervene? Bhasin sir, please go ahead.
Harsh Bhasin. Not Avtar Singh Bhasin.
Yes.
Yeah, there are two Bhasins here. The Chinese keep talking about unequal treaties. I mean, is there such a thing as an equal treaty? I mean, a treaty always results when there is a conflict or a war, and the winning side imposes its conditions on the losing side. So why do the Chinese keep talking about unequal treaties? There is no such thing as an equal treaty. Vijay, could you perhaps throw some light?
There are equal treaties. Obviously, there are equal treaties. The Indo-Soviet treaty was an equal treaty.
No, those are treaties in peacetime. I mean, in wartime. Have you ever found a treaty that is equal?
I mean, and the unequal treaty of Nanjing was not as a result of war. It was a result of encroachment.
But again, the Treaty of Nanjing was because the British could impose that on China, because they won.
Exactly. I think there are unequal treaties, and this certainly they were. In fact, as much as the Qings exerted their influence on the Khan of Kokand, similarly, the British imperialists, because the Qings at that time were weaker, they imposed themselves, and that certainly is unequal. I think it is. I believe that it is, as you say, it is a reflection of the power balance, but. I think there is legitimate reason for a sort of, let's say, for a sense of humiliation and therefore for retribution. I mean,
I've lost you. I've lost your sound completely, Vijay.
We lost you at some point.
Oh, sorry. The Treaty of Shimonoseki, for example, after the things I know, Japanese war.
Yes. So all treaties in a conflict are unequal. There is no such thing as an equal treaty.
Yeah, I suppose it is, but there is a fiction which people make when a peace after the First World War and the Second World War. They did talk about peace with honor and things like that. So there is, I mean, we don't know how true that is, but that's a fiction.
Okay, thank you, Vijay.
I'd like to add something here. I would like to add, it was unequal in the sense, first of all, China did not want to participate in the conference. It was under British pressure that they had to enter the negotiation. Secondly, until the last day, 3rd July 1914, China, both in Beijing to the British ambassador and in London to the British government, made it clear that they will not sign it. And even the instruction that London had given to McMahon, don't sign the treaty with Tibet alone. If China doesn't sign, no treaty will be signed. But McMahon had his own way of doing things. And though there were clear instructions before 3rd July, there was another telegram which came on 3rd July, but it came late in the evening when the treaty had been signed. This should not have been signed under the previous instruction, but it went there. And the British were guilty of accepting it. And until 1938, this was not made public even. It was not even printed in the HSL's collection of treaties. Therefore, it was to that extent. And secondly, since China did not recognize this treaty all through, because China was a small power at that time compared to the British. British were the strong power, they could enforce it on any country around India. That is how it became unequal. It's not that only after the war you can have an unequal treaty. You can have unequal treaty depending on the balance of power between two powers.
If I can just...
It was in favor of British.
Just to add to Ambassador Harish Bhasin's point, the Chinese stress century of humiliation. I said, why is the century of humiliation? When the Manchus were there, they made it very clear they're not Chinese. They had a separate dress code, in fact, laid out very clearly. So, it was 5 centuries of humiliation. And going back to the Mongols, another 500. But to build a national narrative, you had to whip up this tension. You had to whip up this anti-foreigner feeling to create, because people were doubting that China could become a country. And this was their way. The Chinese Communist Party today specifically uses that. As Xi Jinping said the other day, if you hurt us, we will come to you. Basically saying we shall stone you, basically, We shall use stones and break your head and things like that.
If I may just add to what Shakti sir just said about this century of humiliation, not just 1 century, but maybe 5 centuries, if we talk about the Manchus. And the fact is that no other colonized power, this erstwhile colonized power, talks as much about humiliation as China does. India suffered from colonialism far more than China did, but there is hardly any talk of the kind of humiliation that China talks about. So obviously, this is an internalization of a narrative by China, which suits its convenience. And obviously, it is part of Chinese effort to build their power and build up the feeling of nationalism within China. It is not historically rooted at all.
Just a brief question to Mr. Bhasin. If the British had the kind of influence that you say they did, why did they not force the Chinese to sign the similar agreement and just agree to their initialing it, which obviously they knew would create problems later on?
They couldn't hold the hand and make sign.
Okay.
As far as it was possible to inform London, to inform the ambassador in Beijing that we will not sign it, not once, repeatedly. That is what they could do, except short of British holding it in their hand and making it sign. They couldn't do anything. They did everything.
Exactly. And it was the great game after all. The British were pushing the Chinese to control Tibet and Xinjiang much more to prevent the Russians coming in. Russia was the fear.
Right.
The Russian factor was already finished in 1907. And in that, China was the winner without participating in that convention, Anglo-Russian convention, because both parties agreed that they will deal with Tibet through China only.
Exactly.
China
This is the
was the
point.
winner without being participant.
This is my point. British wanted China to be there. They were very keen that China be there, which is why they didn't demarcate the border.
Bhasin sir, if I can raise this question. Ambassador Talha in his book mentions about the Shimla Convention being signed by Chen Yifan, the nationalist representative, initial, not signed, in diplomatic practice, and I also request Ambassador Nambiar to reflect on this. In diplomatic practice, once you initial a document, it means that there is an agreement between the two parties, here in this case, three parties, and that for all practical purposes, this issue is closed till the agreement is ratified via a treaty, notified to the Vienna Convention, or on other counts. Of course, the latter part has not been done, but the fact that Chen Yifan had initialed the Shimla Conference and the map, the McMahon line. The difference, of course, as you have mentioned in the book, it is about the inner Tibet and outer Tibet. But in the case of the McMahon line, for all practical purposes, from the point of view of bilateral agreement, this is final. But you have argued in your book that this is not final. Could you please explain, sir?
Yes, sir. When the Chinese representative, Ivan Chang, signed an initial treaty, it was made clear and it was agreed by both the parties, the British and the Egyptian, that he is making a provisional, he was in fact forced to initial it. But he said, okay, I initial it subject to I get approval from Beijing, which he did not get. And Chinese informed the British government that though he had initialed it, we have advised him to withdraw, and he has withdrawn, and they should not be considered having withdrawn. But that is only a very initial step. Initial doesn't mean anything unless the treaty is signed and ratified. It will not come into operation unless it is ratified, and China never signed, never ratified. So initial is something which is very, very, that okay, broadly we agree with it, but subject to my government accepting it. It's always subject to. Two treaties may be signed. Why it is done in the headquarters finally? Because it is required under the law. And then
Exactly.
it was
Exactly.
also clarified and it was agreed by the British and the Egyptians at that time that you can withdraw your initial letter if you don't get the permission, and you did not get the permission. That is the
Exactly.
reason.
You have this system, what they call ad referendum. You may agree to certain principles. This was clearly even that it was actually forced on Ivan Chen, and he initialed ad referendum. And eventually, of course, the Chinese government came back and said that they do not agree. So it is quite. In fact, I think even the British government recognized that in terms of the response and the reactions in Whitehall about this particular, the successive viceroys also recognized that, and they were discussing how to deal with it, and they said don't take any action. And as you said, it was actually even they decided deliberately not to include it in the Aitchison's sanads and treaties, etc. initially. It was only later on that Olaf Caro found out it was not done, and they discussed various other things.
Professor Kondapalli?
Yes. Yes, please go ahead.
I think we have, is there any other question?
What?
Then let me thank the wonderful discussion that Bhasin Saab had initiated. We congratulate him on many more successes in this and unearthing many more documents and conversations it's very useful to go back to these days, heydays, and in order to construct our own understanding about the events that unfolded, which is very crucial for us because even today, after 71 years of diplomatic establishment of diplomatic relations, we have not had the line of actual control defined, leave alone delimiting and demarcation. So from that point of view, I think this subject, as you all agree with me, is a very important topic today. And thank very much, Mr. Bhasin, for initiating this, and also to the two distinguished reviewers for the wonderful discussion that was carried out. Let me also thank the NMML for hosting this event. This is a very appropriate time in the background of what we are witnessing in Galwan and aftermath. I think this is a very relevant subject and time. So also for the audience for being patient and enlightening the speakers and the speaker and the discussants with different questions and interventions. Thank you very much. Over to Dr. Mishra.
It has been indeed a very, very illuminating discussion, and we all have, clarified so many things on this very important subject. I thank the chair, Professor Srikanth Kondapalli, for kindly consenting for this discussion, and I once again thank our former director, Shakti Sinha ji, and Ambassador Vijay Nambiar for their participation, and all other members of the audience on behalf of the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, PK.